Okay, let's talk about accessibility. I'm going to put this in things that are harder than you think. I don't actually think that applies to accessibility, but that's where most of my craft videos go, so we'll put this one there as well. Accessibility is about making your game playable by as many people as possible. And it falls into a bunch of different categories. Things like UI, changes to gameplay, changes to the way that audio is handled. This is not a topic that I am fully qualified to talk about. My best advice on accessibility is to find people who use these features and to interact with those people. Get their opinions on what works and what doesn't work. I will add some links in the description to some resources that I have found, but if you have someone on your team, that's even better. UI is probably the single biggest category of place you need to consider for accessibility, but in a lot of ways maybe the easiest one to deal with. Right off the bat, if you can, give people the ability to scale your fonts. Now that might not be possible for you to do in all your UIs, but if you watched my localization video, you know that you should give yourself some extra space. So if you have that extra space, you might be able to allow people to scale up the text in many of your UIs. Maybe not all of them, but at least some of them. Really important ones would be anything where there are large blocks of text. So item descriptions, subtitles, if you've got little stories placed throughout the world, those are places where being able to control the size of text is particularly important. The very small labels in UIs can be very hard to read, so rather than necessarily allowing the player to scale those up, another option is to make it so that the UI is understandable even if they can't read that particular label. Having an icon instead of the label, or having a tooltip that pops up when the label is hovered over that gives a better, more detailed description and gives you a lot more room for a larger font. In addition to scaling the font, if you are using a special custom font, consider having a backup font that is more clear and more crisp that a player can switch to if they're having difficulty deciphering that font. So if you've had something custom built that's got lots of special serifs and very elaborate letter forms, having something that's just a very clean, crisp fallback will allow players who are having difficulty deciphering that font still be able to understand your UIs. Similarly, if you have parallaxing or motion in your UIs, that can look really nice, but for some people that can lead to motion sickness or difficulty reading your UI. So you should think about potentially giving an option to turn that off. Obviously, this is going to undercut your artistic vision for the UI, but that's okay because this is specifically for people that are having difficulty using the UI. So better to have something that loses a little bit of flair and is actually usable as opposed to them just bouncing out of your game because they can't understand what's going on. That said, I do think it's a good practice to give yourself as much room for text, make your default font size as big as you are comfortable with, because if you do that, then you don't necessarily need to provide the ability to scale up fonts because the font's already big. And you can really design around that as opposed to really tight, really busy UI where you may have a lot of difficulty accommodating a larger font. If you can, it would be ideal to have some form of vocalization in your UIs that can be turned on. This means that people who have limited eyesight, but still might be able to play your games, can navigate your UIs because the game can read out the different categories, the different elements that they're highlighting so that they can find what they're looking for. It can still be difficult and you can only take this so far, but if you can accommodate this, then you actually open up the game to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to figure out how to navigate the UIs, even though they might be sighted enough to navigate your world. Another aspect of UI is dealing with color blindness. There are three primary types of color blindness. I'm going to put them up on the screen now. I'm not going to try to read them out loud. And the approach requires different work for each of them. There are a few different ways to approach this. One possible way to do it is to do a full screen filter that changes the saturation of different colors. This can make the game more readable. There is a little bit of disagreement in the various communities as to whether or not people actually want there to be a filter applied to the gameplay as opposed to simply just the UIs, because if you are someone that has this form of color blindness, when you perceive the world, you perceive the world through that color blindness, and maybe you feel that you are adapted to seeing the world in that way. There isn't actual agreement within the community as to which is the right approach there. But a full screen filter is kind of a brute force approach. It doesn't require a lot of thought. It's pretty easy to do, but it does degrade your visuals significantly, and often in ways that don't actually help the person who has color blindness. So they are able to read your game better, but at the cost of visual fidelity. There are other better approaches. A different approach, or maybe even a complementary approach, is to allow players to map the colors that are used for important information. If you're using green circles for allies and red circles for enemies, if someone has a form of red-green color blindness, that can basically be useless. So if you allow players to change the colors that are used for these purposes, this allows them to get that readability back. Additionally, it's worth considering not actually using color only when you're trying to convey information. So if you have a hit marker and you use red, and you have a heal marker and you use green, that's not great. But if you have hit marker and you use a red minus sign, and you have a heal marker and you use a green plus sign, then even if you can't differentiate those colors, you are able to still tell which one is which. Okay, moving on from UI into controls. Probably the most widely used form of accessibility in controls is the ability to invert the y-axis. The y-axis inversion comes down to sort of a subconscious understanding of what is going on. Are you driving the camera up and down, in which case up would mean looking down, or are you tilting the camera up and down, in which case up would mean looking up? But it's not something people really have a conscious ability to control. If you are someone that needs the y-axis inverted, it's very difficult to play a game that does not provide this inversion. But this actually extends beyond just the y-axis and also covers the x-axis. Some people actually have the same effect with the x-axis as well, where they actually feel that to look to the right, they should be pushing to the left. This is much more rare, but it does occur. So if you're already allowing players to invert the y-axis, why not allow them to invert the x-axis as well? The more control you give the player over the way the controls are mapped out, the better. Because some people have limited mobility in one of their hands, or they're using a different control setup, and the ability to change the mapping so that they can customize where different actions occur opens the game up to them and allows them to play it in a more complete way. As part of allowing controller mapping, something to consider is to allow players to turn things in your game that are holds into toggles. So if you have a sprint, which is holding down the left trigger, changing that into a toggle where they can push a single button to enter sprint allows people who might have an inability to hold a button for any length of time to access those features. Controller mapping can be a fairly complicated screen, but once you've done it once, there's no reason that you need to reinvent this screen for every subsequent game. I talked about audio a little bit in my actual video about audio, but you do need to remember that some of your players are going to be unwilling or unable to get information out of your audio sound map. When you're doing your audio design, that needs to be taken into account. Very base level thing is provide the ability to turn subtitles on for your dialogue, because that means if I can't hear or I can't understand what people are saying, it still gives me the option to understand what's going on. And this might might not just be about people who have difficulty hearing. It could be people who have difficulty parsing what is being said because of the soundscape. Or it could be people that are struggling with the language the game is coming in, and by having both reading and audio together, it improves their ability to understand. I was able to watch Lupin on Netflix in the original French by turning on French subtitles, because the combination of the French language and the French subtitles was enough for me to keep up with the language in the show. So definitely provide a subtitle option for your dialogue. But additionally, with audio, you should make sure that there is some sort of visual component alongside the audio to make sure that information is getting across, at least critical information. Audio is an amazing way to provide 3D information, especially for things that aren't even on screen at the moment. But you really need a backup, because if I have the audio turned off, if I have difficulty hearing, if I just don't have a surround sound set up or am wearing headphones, that positional information isn't going to come across. In the case of gameplay, the first and most obvious accessibility option is difficulty. I've talked about difficulty before and talked about the fact that in a perfect world, this is something that would be more complex than simply a easy, medium, hard, nightmare sort of toggle. Here is the place where you actually get the opportunity to provide a lot of accessibility to your gameplay. Because if you can slow down the amount of reflex that is required for your jumping puzzles, or open up the hit windows for your combat, this can help people be able to play your game more easily. But this can extend beyond simply combat difficulty, because in conversations, some people can become very easily overwhelmed by the decisions that are presented to them. Providing them some way to simplify that matrix may be something that's worth looking into. Providing them a way to help make decisions in leveling up their character or equipping new equipment. These are all things that fall under accessibility, because they help people to access different parts of your game, as opposed to either simply ignoring them or being unable to enjoy your game because they can't use a feature that's critical for them to understand. So if you really want to dig in on this, here's how you do it. Look at each of the player-facing systems and features in your game and ask the question, what are the barriers to that system or feature being used by different players? And then once you've identified those barriers, what are ways that you can help those players get past those barriers and use the system or work around the system in a way that will still let them enjoy your game. The path around those barriers doesn't necessarily have to be the best path. If you are auto-leveling a character to help players who are having difficulty with that, you don't necessarily have to make the optimal character, you just have to make a good character. If you are helping players through the environment, through navigational aids, it doesn't have to be the optimal path. In fact, you might want to lean towards more scenic routes, but you still provide them ways around the things that are getting in their way and preventing them from fully enjoying your game. With gameplay accessibility, I think you have an issue that doesn't apply as much to the other parts of accessibility, which is explaining features to the player in a way that they can understand. If you look at the accessibility screen that's actually up on screen right now from Guardians of the Galaxy, you can see that actually it's not really clear what some of these features even do, because I haven't played the game yet. I don't necessarily know what these various forms of lock-on and elemental targeting even mean. So with people that have a high need for accessibility, you have an issue because they might not understand what you're presenting them in a way that allows them to actually use the features that they might want to use. Something that I feel is under-considered in accessibility is navigation. You want most of your players to be engaging in the environments, to be looking at the level art and considering the way that they're going to move and considering about what should be able to be interacted with based upon the art as opposed to an icon that is shown upon the art. But not everyone is going to be able to do that. So how can you provide people that can't do that the ability to figure out what they can interact with and what they can't? So some things that I've started to see is you are seeing the ability to put highlights around items that can be interacted with, that can be turned on, or in even more extreme cases, you're seeing the ability to desaturate the level to allow the objects in the level to pop out because they are what remain colored. This is an extreme accessibility option that obviously has a massive impact upon the look of your game. But again, these are options that would be off by default, and by including them, you're giving people who otherwise wouldn't be able to figure out how to navigate your world the ability to do so. Navigational aids can go as far as to actually provide pathing hints or other ways to figure out how to move through the space, because some people won't be able to easily figure that out. It's hard to talk about gameplay accessibility without talking about one of the more controversial accessibility features, which is aim assist. So I'm all for aim assist, and it is something that opens your game up to more people. A lack of aim assist is something that basically makes a lot of first-person shooters inaccessible to a surprising number of players. If your game is non-competitive, then aim assist is something that comes without a lot of downside. So up until now, most of what I've been talking about has been ignoring the consequences that things may have to your gameplay. If you allow me to change the text size or remap buttons on my controller, this is not something that is changing the difficulty of the game. However, if you're doing some of the other things I've talked about, like putting highlights on things that can be interacted with, or changing the contrast between objects in the world and the world itself, this actually changes the difficulty of the game. And that's kind of the point. But when you are making a game that has a competitive component, you need to start to consider that. I don't have the best answer here as to what you should be doing in a competitive game in terms of accessibility, because things like aim assist or highlights or slowing down the input requirements can give an advantage to some of your players who are taking advantage of that. And if your game is very competitive, what may happen is you might end up in a situation where everyone ends up using your accessibility features because of the advantage it gives them. And your first instinct on this might be to say, well, so what? So what if everyone uses these accessibility features? Well, there are two problems with that. First of all, you're not really leveling the playing field, are you? Because the things you're doing to make the game more accessible for some of your players is simply making it way easier for others. But the other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of these features, especially things around graphics accessibility, audio accessibility, and gameplay accessibility, potentially are coming at the cost of the fidelity of your game. So if a player who doesn't need this accessibility feature is using it because of the competitive advantage it gives them, that can result in them having a worse experience of playing your game. And people often will choose to pick a feature simply because it makes them better, even though they have a worse experience playing the game. And in not a very long period of time, that worse experience is going to make them leave your game and stop playing. So you don't want players to use features that make the game worse for them from a fidelity perspective simply because they make the game easier to win at. Because too much interaction with that sort of feature is actually just going to result in them not playing your game at all. So for competitive games, this can be quite a balancing act. But in a single player game, I don't think this is a relevant conversation. I think you can provide even very extreme accessibility options, like making the background black and white and increasing the contrast of all of the actors in your world simply to let some people see what's going on and not really really be that concerned that some people are getting an unfair advantage because there's no competitive aspect in the game here. One legal thing that needs to be mentioned when we talk about accessibility is the CVAA, which is an American law which is about accessibility for communication services. The video game industry actually had a waiver that meant it didn't have to worry about the CVAA, but that waiver actually expired at the end of 2018, which means that games that have come out since 2018 have needed to take this into account. My understanding of the CVAA, and this is not legal advice, so do your own research, is that it's focused specifically on access to communication. And so that means that if your game is an online game that has either some form of text chat or some form of voice chat, you need to provide accessibility options for either of those or both of those. So that means if you have voice chat, you need to make it possible for someone who cannot read your UI to access your voice chat in some way. If you have text chat, you need to provide some way for that text chat to be read aloud so that they can still hear what is being typed by other players. It's very focused specifically on the communications aspect of accessibility, but it is now something that needs to be taken into account in your game development. Again, do your own research on this one because it is pretty new in application to games, so this is a place where I imagine the discussion is still evolving in terms of what is required and how enforcement is going to come down. Maybe you have implemented all of these accessibility options, and now what? Because as I discussed on my video about options, an option screen filled with a billion different options isn't particularly useful. Players need to know that these options are available to them for them to get any benefit out of them at all. What you may need to do with some of these things is to actually put them in front of the player the first time they play the game right up front so that they can pick their color blindness settings if that's something that they need, or they can have the screen reader turned on by default until they can figure out whether they need it or not. A lot of games now will actually figure out the y-axis inversion simply by having the player look up as one of the first things that they do in the game, and then just setting the option based upon whichever way they push the thumbstick instinctually. But as you get more and more accessibility options available, this solution becomes impractical. You can't put every single option in front of them up front, or the beginning of the game becomes this tedious and quite confusing mess of different options that some people won't even understand. So we do still need to continue the conversation about how we get options in front of the player in a way that they can actually interact with the ones that they need. Okay, this is quite a lot, and you might be feeling like, how can I possibly do all of this? And the short answer I have is, I don't think you should be trying to do all of this. I think this is something that you build up over many games. And how do you do that? Well, the best way to do that is by building upon what you've done before, not throwing out the work you've done in previous games for accessibility simply because you're doing a new game. Build upon what you have, and that will allow you to, over time, build up your accessibility into better and better states. This can be a very tempting area to cut because each individual accessibility feature is only addressing a small percentage of your audience. But if you resist that temptation, you are over time increasing the number of people that can play your game. And that is something that we should all want. Microsoft is actually really good on the topic of accessibility. They have developed special controllers specifically with accessibility in mind. They have the Xbox accessibility guidelines. So if you are interested in this topic, I definitely recommend checking out the resources that Microsoft provides. Even if you're not building a game for the Xbox, I think it's a great place to start digging in on this topic. 2 games to definitely check out for excellence in accessibility. The recent Ratchet & Clank has a very comprehensive list of things that they support for accessibility, some of them taking things much further than I've seen in any other game. We can't talk about accessibility without mentioning Apex Legends, which introduced ping, which is a very big step forward in terms of accessibility in chat and communication in a multiplayer game. Fundamentally, I think your goal in building a video game should be to make your game available to as many people as you can. There will be situations where, by the nature of the design of your game, certain accessibility allowances aren't possible because you are making a game that is entirely driven by audio. So people who can't hear can't play your game. Or you are doing a game that's entirely about very subtle differences in color, which is going to eliminate people that have certain forms of color blindness from playing your game. And it's not to say that you shouldn't be making games like that, but a lot of games don't really legitimately have an argument against accessibility. There might be things that you want, like you want players to look at your level art, but that in and of itself isn't enough of a reason to not pursue accessibility options that might accommodate people whose ability to consume your level art is reduced. So I think you need to really carefully consider your objection to certain accessibility options. Is it coming from a legitimate place of the actual core of your game design, or is it simply a want and you are eliminating potential players because of something that you want? But each of these accessibility options is obviously work, and probably you can't do all of them, at least not off the bat. So this is something that our industry needs to work our way towards getting better and better at as we move forward. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. If you found this video interesting or thought-provoking, give it a thumbs up because that will help YouTube understand that people are engaging in it. I feel like I'm only scratching the surface on accessibility, and I feel like I've likely missed some accessibility options that are either needed or missing from games. If so, let me know down in the comments because I think this is a conversation definitely worth having. I will see you again soon. Thank you.